This is a production of Cornell University.
The first is one of my graduate students, PhD student in plant breeding, Maylin Murdock, and the focus of her research, remote sensing, mainly for phenotyping in our breeding program, but also eventually perhaps for crop management. But what we have done here at this stop is built in a lot of free time, because in this trial here, there is quite a bit of genetic variability, and we wanted to give you the opportunity to walk through the field and see the phenotypic differences and ask us questions, Q&A. So with no further ado, I will pass the mic to May.
Thank you, Larry. As Larry said, my name is Maylin Murdock. I'm a first year, going into my second year PhD student. With an interest in digital agriculture, specifically remote sensing, as it applies to hemp breeding and production systems. And there is an additional speaker today, Kathleen. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, I am not working in hemp. My name is Kathleen, and I work with grapes, but May and I are doing very related sort of investigations and using similar tools.
So how we'd like to kind of organize this, we're going to do a brief introduction, and then we're going to split into two groups. One group will be in the field with me, and another group would be here with Kathleen, kind of talking about sensors and applications, and more, give you guys more chances to really ask your questions about remote sensing applications. So just a quick show of hands. How many are familiar with the term remote sensing? We love this. How many are familiar with drones and use of drones for agriculture? Okay, nice. Well, then I'll give a brief kind of overview of what it means to remote sense and our aims and goals here. So essentially, remote sensing is learning and collecting information about the Earth's surface without being in contact to it. Specifically, I'm interested in hemp, Kathleen, grapes. And we utilize drones on a week-to-week, honestly daily basis, besides the weekends. And we've been doing this the entire summer almost, I think, trying to figure out how to best acquire digital traits and correlate them with, what we see in the field with our eyes on a day-to-day basis. So our aim with remote sensing is essentially to kind of bridge the gaps with genetic improvements. We can do a lot genetically now, but there's not a lot we can do phenotypically unless you have a large or big team with you, right? And I know many growers and farmers, have larger acreages of this than we have. So really we hope to improve the status of how can you collect phenotypic data and how can you do that at a high throughput. So we're going to split into two groups. The group that will be me will go and talk about this field trial, and then the group that will be here will talk about sensors and applications.
There are two different drones that do two different things. So right over here, this is called the M100, and this guy has two cameras on it. So there's the white one over here, that's a near-infrared camera, and those are wavelengths that we as humans don't pick up, but they're just outside the visible range, and they're great for monitoring things like plant health because they give you a lot of information about the structure of different leaves. So when really any type of stress is affecting a plant and the leaves either start to wilt or maybe looking a little bit yellower, the near infrared is really sensitive to that. So that's the reason why that added camera is there. And then the red, green, blue camera there's a little red device under there. So that's what's on this drone. And as you can tell, this is smaller, right? So it's a lot more lightweight. It can go a lot further and be in the air for longer because it's not carrying as much. This is the M600, obviously a lot bigger, and this has two sensors on it. One of them is this camera down here, and that actually does 10 different wave bands. So you've got red, green, blue, but you've also got finer gradations within that spectrum. And that's, again, really helpful because not only are we getting things that we could pick up if we were in the air, but we also get more information from different ranges of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can't see. There's also a thermal camera on this one, and that gives obviously information about temperature. So as many of you guys probably know, evapotranspiration and stomatal conductance are two metrics that can tell us a lot about what's happening in a particular plant, and being able to see that from up high and see maybe areas where your plants are looking a lot hotter in one particular part of the field than another could be really informative, especially when we're thinking about things like irrigation, water stress, and also for some diseases. So these are the two tools that we are using, and May and I primarily actually have been flying the M600 this summer to get a little bit finer detail. When we go out with these drones, there are a couple of steps that are required to make a flight happen. So one of those is the flight plan. We are not, because we're using this for data collection, we want things to be pretty consistent. We have a flight plan that's the same every week. So we're not manually flying this over this field. It's a pre-programmed flight that we set up, and that ensures that the drone will follow the exact same path every week so that we have consistency over time. We can obviously fly it manually if something were to occur and go wrong and we needed to switch that up. And that's what the remote control here is for. And so this little stand is where you would put a smartphone, a tablet, so you could sort of see your path on the phone, and that's where you would also be able to do things like land it automatically if you wanted to. And then the joysticks are for the actual manual flight. And as an example, you can see the flight plan that we have for this field up here, and you guys feel free to come closer if you want. But it's a pretty standard sort of area scan, so it's a rectangular back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And you can switch things, right? Like you can make it fly lower, you can make it fly higher, you can tighten up the interval between those consecutive paths over the field if you want to have many, many overlapping images. Any questions about any of this thus far?
So
Or not about
when
any
you
of this?
collect data, you're collecting digital images, and you suspect that there's something that's happening there, pest infestation, something. How do you corroborate that or validate that on the ground?
That's a really good question. So May and I have slightly different projects. I'm working with disease, and so for us, ground truthing corroboration looks like weekly scouting in, for me it's a vineyard, but so every week on the same day that the drone flies, we go out and we look at every single vine and we say, okay, on this vine, this is our percentage of infection. And then at the end of the season, take those digital images from that particular day and say, all right, this is what we got from the image, whether that's a vegetation index or whether that's a specific band, and see what's the relationship between that index or between the value of that band and the level of disease we saw. May is using it for something slightly different because she's looking at sort of different traits and differentiating between different types of hemp plants. So her ground truthing is actually a lot more extensive. So they're taking things like heights, like leaf diameter. They've been doing, I guess we've both been doing stomatal conductance, but for different reasons. So it depends what you want to use the digital imagery for will determine the measurements you take on the ground to validate that. But that is a really critical piece of this because at the end of the day, this will give you a picture. That picture is pretty much useless unless you know something about what was happening on the ground at that particular time.
So are these going to be made available to farmers?
So the idea is, at least right now, we're interested in figuring out what are those relationships, and if a farmer does have a drone and has images, sort of turning that image into information and making that a very seamless process. These can range in cost, as you might imagine, from like hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars. So the model for application on a given farm will probably look very different from place to place. One of the things that I think would be really amazing is if there was sort of like a central service, right? Okay, there's the drone team. I want my field scanned. I call this person, the scan happens, and then I get basically a map of either crop health or maybe heights or biomass or whatever it is that I'm interested in.
You've just become the entrepreneur. There you go.
There you go.
You need to do that.
That's not, obviously I'm a PhD student, that's not what I'm here for, but that's like something that, is interesting to think about, right, is okay, what is that's kind of why I got into this in the first place with, how do we bring this to an actual farm? And what would that look like?
So eventually the user would not actually have to do his or her own ground truthing.
Yep, exactly. And I think yes and no, right? This will never replace a person. This is never going to be smarter than a human. But the idea would be that, for example, if you have hundreds of acres to manage and you're concerned about a particular pest or a particular disease, having an idea of this is where I want to look first, because I know based on my images that this particular quadrant of the field is looking a lot more stressed out than everywhere else. And maybe that's where to sort of begin that process of, okay, I want to focus here, see what's going on, and manage accordingly. So not as a replacement, I would say, but more so as a complement, as a tool, to make this a little bit easier.
You mentioned a flight plan, so do you have to have a pilot's license? And
You do have to have a pilot's license, and it's relatively almost scarily easy to obtain one. You don't have to prove that you can fly it. You just have to know the rules about, okay, where are you allowed to fly a drone and where are you not allowed to fly a drone, and sort of things to take into account as far as like air conditions and most of it is safety. It's a bit like getting a permit before you get your driver's license, but it's administered through the FAA. You can prepare for the exam online, take it. There are testing centers all over the country, so it's the licensing process is quite straightforward.
so a large grape producer, large fruit producer could certainly be able to afford their own drone and
Yeah,
be able
absolutely.
to monitor their own crops.
Yep. And the software to make these flight plans is also very easy to obtain. I think the biggest sort of missing piece would be that turning the images right into information. That, I think, is the part that we're trying to make simpler and much faster than it is right now.
So this is speculation, but
How stable are they with updrafts or downdrafts?
Yeah, they are below certain wind speeds. They're very, very stable. So we cannot fly this with wind speeds above 12 miles an hour. It would not be advisable. But that being said, I mean, when wind speeds are under 12 miles an hour, it's really, really stable. So you don't see it up there shaking around.
So what is this?
This, we're right about there actually right now. Yeah, I do check this every morning, but we are at,
15 or so.
yeah, let's see what we got.
Gusts that come on.
Yeah, we've got average 8, gusts of 18. Yeah.
What's your battery like on the two?
Yeah, good question. So this one takes 6 batteries, and these are the little slots where they go in. That will get us about 23 total minutes of flight time. So it takes, when we scan this field, that's about a 7-minute scan. So we could do that 3 times would be pushing it, but we could do that 3 times. And again, like the length of your scan depends on how high you're flying, how many times you want to pass over. But yeah.
But also wind speed.
So wind speed does impact that, yeah.
How fast does it travel?
You can set that. For scans like this, we set it at 2 meters per second or 3 meters per second. But you could fly it, I mean, you probably I wouldn't want to fly it over 5 meters per second, but you could. You definitely
You
could.
would still get the same information.
You get the same information, but you might not get the best quality of images because you would get sort of, imagine, it's flying quicker, so the captures, even if you're capturing at the same rate, you might not get as much overlap between your images, so you could have perhaps one image of the same sort of footprint on the ground, whereas when we fly at a lower speed, you would get maybe 3 overlapping images of that same area, so if one image is a little bit off, you would have sort of a backup.
How long is that one gonna last?
This guy, I think we could probably get 35 on a set of batteries. Yeah. So
What's the cost of that bigger one there?
this, with no cameras, and actually it's funny, the cameras are usually the more expensive piece. With no cameras, I want to say that one comes in around 10 grand. Yeah.
Without the camera?
Without the camera.
And with the cameras?
With the cameras, I'm going to be honest, I don't know how much these cameras cost. I didn't want to ask. But
How about that guy?
this one, much less. So I think probably about half as much for that one, if that. Yeah,
Without the camera.
without the camera.
So how do you identify the individual plants? You have stakes, tags out there, or?
It depends. Yeah, it
coordinates?
depends on the field. What we do for grapes is we basically went out and we took the location of each post that's in the vineyard, and so we know, okay, we have those points right in the image where we know the posts are. So in between those points, within a certain width, that's our vine. For things like hemp, like for this field, from the picture, you see very clearly where the individual plants are, but there is a bit of manual work that goes into sort of segmenting out.
But this is kind of a small lot, but if
Yep.
you have a large one.
And that's a huge challenge to image processing, is quickly obtaining only the areas that you want, right? If you don't care about the tarp, you don't want to be analyzing the tarp, but segmenting out the parts that you care about, that's a challenge for sure. Yeah.
Now, do you have a program that processes the images to kind of give you or do you have to?
To a certain extent, yes. But the segmentation piece, that's something that we're working on to automate that. That does not exist yet, and we're hoping to build that so that you could feasibly scan 100 acres and then say, okay, of that 100 acres, I want to look at only the pixels that correspond to my crop, and not the weeds, not the dirt, nothing else. Yeah.
You mentioned that your area is disease, and you can also tell from the imagery if the vines are being drought stressed or stressed for other reasons. Could it also be used in the spring to see if there is freeze death? So if you wait when the vines are coming out of dormancy and fly it, then you can see how many vines are not producing any.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we're working on that right now, not with drones, but with proximal sensors that you actually mount on a tractor. And so there are cameras that you would mount on the tractor, and you go through the vineyard, and they take images of each side of the tractor, so each row. And with that, you get readings from the canopy, so you can tell exactly when everything is starting to push out shoots. Okay, if there was a lot of winter kill, there are some plants that you're not going to see any green whatsoever, and that will come out. So that's one of the applications that we're looking at to kind of get a better sense at the very beginning of the season. Okay, how much winter damage is there, and is there anything that we can do with pruning to make sure that there's a decent crop load?
And where could I look up information on those sensors to mount on a four-wheeler or side-by-side? Mm-hmm. Where could I look for that?
Yeah, there is, if you look, so there's a company called Cropscape that has the sensors that we've been using for grapes. And for the drones, I would say DJI, so the letters DJI, that's the company that manufactures these two and is probably, at this point, one of the better known, but also higher quality for research purposes manufacturers of drones. And they have a lot of sort of options as far as pieces of equipment and sensors.
So you could get a used drone probably much cheaper than.
I bet you could. Yeah, 100%. And that's not by any means the only company. Like there are many that are equally good as far as quality goes. I think it's more about learning on the user side, making sure that the person is comfortable with flying it.
So I'm sure you guys had a lot of great conversations with Kathleen over there learning about sensors and applications, and you're definitely more than welcome to ask me a bit about it. Last session we kind of got drifted away in talking about seeds and seeds companies, so we'll try to keep this one more specific to remote sensing. So like I said, our aim, Cornell Hemp's aim with remote sensing, it's really, this is kind of a foundational trial for the remote sensing efforts with Cornell Hemp, and I only in my second year now, so I'm really hoping to kind of refine this in my later years. But this is you're standing really in our white space trial, and this white space trial has 4 different populations. 2 are quote cultivars. You can see very quickly that this is not uniform, and to be a cultivar you need to be uniform. And then the last 2 down there, which we'll go over in the next session with Jacob, are some of our own Cornell Hemp produced populations. So yeah, what I mean by white spaced is 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet. You'll notice that we have black weed fabric here, and we have beds with black tarp. This really helps me in my remote sensing efforts. Like I said, we do weekly, daily flights really, and a lot of ground truthing measurements. So this kind of helps keep the weeds away and really pinpoint the plant of interest that we need. So our goal with this trial specifically is plant architecture, growth stages, and yield estimation. It's been done in a lot of crops, and this one has had a lot of literature supporting, so now we just need to, all we need to do, right, is kind of make those studies happen, then have a good model for prediction for farmers and growers to use. So in that, our specific goals here are extensive phenotyping. Like I said, me and the rest of the Cornell research team, a good amount of us, are here on a weekly basis, measuring height, diameter, getting leaf area, sampling, getting a lot of these measurements to really correlate and truth, right, our drone flight and our imagery that we get. We also aim to reconstruct individual plants, so creating individual plant models, and that would be with Lidar sensors. I'm sure Kathleen went over what Lidar sensors are, so yeah, do definitely reconstruct, fibbing here. Reconstruct individual plant models, and then with like multispectral sensors, like I said, I'm sure she mentioned, to really evaluate vegetation indices, and I'm sure she went over a couple of them already, so this makes it a great group to talk to. But essentially knowing those for, plant health, knowing those for disease, knowing those for what my biomass might be at the end of the season. Really just having a lot. So the goal is, reconstruct the models, evaluate the indices. Those taken together, essentially, would allow us to identify the optimal digital traits needed to gather that information in terms of yield estimation, right? So then we no longer have a Cornell Hemp research team crew coming out here on a week-to-week basis. We have a flight team maybe of 2 to 5, not a lot, doing this on a week-to-week basis and sitting at their computer in nice cool air instead of being out here on a hot day. With that, like I said, this is a very foundational trial for me, and so through this I'm also exploring things like color, impacts of color, things like sex determination, chemotyping, right? Do I have a high THC plant? Do I have a high CBD plant? And flowering time. So these first 2 populations we have out here that I mentioned, you could see the variability in flowering time. We've had stuff starting in early July, and I'm sure we're still going to get flowering starting like in October. So really doing that on a weekly basis would allow us to see, what is, what's going on with this population. Also, too, we're getting genetic data, so that already confounds it a lot more and gives us more information that we need. And those last 2 populations down there are a basis for color exploration and kind of, plant yield. But yeah, do we have any questions?
Are you, when you fly over, are you determining heights of the plants as well?
Yes, so on a bi-weekly or week-to-week basis, we are collecting height data with a team of 4 to 5 people out here, and then with the drones, we're going to be able to see and kind of correlate those height measurements with the drone measurements. And you can do that essentially with a digital elevation model, a digital surface model, of your field, and if you know your plant layout and have some kind of markers, so you'll see throughout the field we have like these things called GCPs. They're like white tiles, and what that stands for is ground control points. And that allows us to not only overlay week by week for the same points, but if we had those GCPs raised, it would allow us to benchmark that we know that this GCP is always at this height, and if a plant is at this height. So another method to kind of really support what we're seeing in terms of height.
You balance. You've got a plant a week ago that was standing straight up. You've had a lot of wind from the west, which I see.
Yep.
The plant's sitting at a 25-degree angle, so the height is actually less than it was a week
Correct.
ago.
So the height actually is the height that we get on a week-to-week basis is the above ground level height, not the stem length or what the actual height of the plant would be. Does that?
Measuring from the ground level to the apical stem?
Yeah, so for instance, if we come over here a bit, you can kind of see this one is a bit lodged. If I stood it up properly, that would be the height. But our height measurements on the week-to-week basis only goes from the above ground level, because that's exactly,
At that angle.
yep, that's exactly what the drone is going to see.
Okay.
And then the nice thing about having it on a week-to-week, you can also, the nice thing with drones is you can also get percent lodging. They do that in a lot of other crops, so then we'll be able to know. But yeah, that is the one thing. You can't get what the actual potential height of the plant might be, but you can guesstimate it from accounting for lodging and the height that you're getting.
How do you calculate the leaf area?
The leaf area, yeah. So with leaf area, there's a leaf area index, and that's really done. Yeah, they do it less with multispectral sensors and more with Lidar sensors. And Lidar sensors are the ones that is an active sensor that shoots lasers, essentially, or just shoots a laser, really, and scans. And so with that data, you can calculate leaf area index, but then there's also nice handheld tools that allow us to measure out in the field, right? We can go below canopy. There's a wand, also called an LAI, for the same purpose, and it will give us a measurement of the leaf area index. And then we can also do leaf samples on a weekly basis or at certain time points to get leaf area.
What do you mean by leaf sample?
Yeah, just pick a leaf, right, and then try to keep it consistent throughout the field. You can scan it. So there's also tools to have like a flatbed scanner to scan the leaf. But yeah, I'm going to cut our conversation. We're going to go over to the next session, and then I probably took a lot of your free time for after.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.